Good afternoon, I'm Yolanda Nava, and this is Do You See What I See? We have an extraordinary guest today. In recent weeks, he has been the recipient of 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards. Herman Gallegos is a civil rights pioneer. He has served on numerous corporate and foundation boards. He is the founder of Hispanics in Philanthropy. Congratulations, Herman, and welcome. It's such an honor to have you on the program today.
Thank you. This is a great privilege for me to have this conversation with you. You're a trailblazer of your own, so it should be a very happy conversation.
Well, it's going to be a productive conversation because you've had a fascinating life. And let's go back to the beginning. Your roots were in Colorado, a time that you described as grim and poor. How did that beginning shape your character?
If I were running for office or thinking of running for office, then reciting what sounds like a poor boy's story is maybe something that people do. But I think in this case, it might be interesting to share bits about this bit of history, personal history, because it had a lot to do with shaping what I did in life because of where I was born and those circumstances around me. So believe me, it's not a poor boy story. It's more a story of coincidence and intrigue in some ways, because I was born in a Scrabble mining town of Aguilar, Colorado, which is in southern Colorado. My dad was a miner there. And the interesting part about that is that Aguilar is just a stone's throw from another little town called Ludlow, Colorado. Ludlow was the site of the 1914 Ludlow massacre. Of course, that was before I was born, but the interesting part about that is that the miners had gone on strike in protest of the conditions at the mines that they were working in, and they set up a tent city, and there were women and children housed there in the strike. And unfortunately, on Easter Sunday in 1914, the state militia was called out and killed women and children, and many of them suffocated in cellars that were underneath the floor of the tents where they were living. Well, what is interesting about this history is that the person allegedly responsible for calling out the state militia was none other than John D. Rockefeller. John D. was the head of the one of the stockholders of the Colorado Iron and Fuel Company, which depended on coal and coke to produce the steel. And of course, during the World War II, World War I, coal was king because it was needed for the production of armaments. Well, who would know that about 40, 50 years later, one day I was visiting my father, who was retired living in San Francisco, and he would always greet me with what's new. Well, in this case, I said to him, Dad, I've just joined the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. You what? My dad almost jumped out of his rocker. And he said, well, what will you be doing with Mr. Rockefeller? I said, well, the only thing I could think of saying was, I'm going to be giving away his money. Well, how much money do you give? I said, well, I think this year probably 100 million. He said, well, that sounds like a nice thing to do. And every time I'd go to see him, how are you doing giving away Mr. Rockefeller's money? Well, what was happening is the stock market was going up. So even though we were legally required to pay out 5% of the money, we were earning 15%. I didn't do a very good job of giving away the money. But I think it was a coincidence of sorts, but it also led me to another bit of history that I recite when I get asked the question, well, you seem to belong to a lot of boards and commissions. How many did you belong to? And this is where the Rockefeller story comes in. One of the persons most influential in pushing Mr. Rockefeller to give his money or to designate his money for a charitable cause before he passed away was the Reverend Charles Gates. On the retirement of his leaving the Rockefeller Foundation, he attended the trustee meeting and he addressed the board in this way. He said, gentlemen, there were no women on the board at that time. What do you think your maker will ask of you when you pass away? Do you think he's going to ask you how many awards you've received or how much money you've earned or how much notoriety you received? No, he will ask one question and one question only. And that question is this. He slammed his fist on the desk and he said, The question your maker will ask of you is, what did you do as a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation? Now, I think that question is apropos to many of us who have been in the civil rights struggle for decades, that yes, we have earned our share of awards and we're grateful for that. And I do get asked the question, how many boards have you belonged to? And I think the more important question is, what did you do as a member of those boards? Did you challenge the status quo? Did you create any opportunities for people left behind? And I think that's what I need to talk about, is what have I done with respect to that recognition that I've received. But the fact of the matter is that people who have done great things don't get recognized. And I think it is a problem that was best laid in focus and put in focus by Congress member Joaquin Castro from San Antonio, who spoke recently about this very same problem. He said, look, as long as our own stories and voices continue to be written out of the textbooks, omitted in film, omitted in TV and print, and minimal in the C-suites and in the decision-making positions of power, people will continue to see Latinos, if they see them at all, as something other than inherently American. So I think the invisibility of the things we have done has created a lot of feeling that the paradigm describing the civil rights struggle is really seen in black and white, and it does not take into account the struggles that Mexican Americans have faced in this country, fighting racism, discrimination. And I think that's part of the conversation I'd like to have with you, to kind of share what the one generation of Mexican Americans and Latinos have done, and then what does the future look like in terms of the new generation of leadership that will continue the struggle, for justice and equity in this country.
Well, we're certainly on the same page, Herman, because I'm a history major going back to UCLA. And to me, sharing history and understanding our history, understanding that this was this country was part of Spain for 300 years. It was part of Mexico for 25, and there was a war that ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where the United States became part of Mexico. What was going to become the United States became part of Mexico. So history is really important, and understanding it is vital. You grew up during the Depression, and yes, you say it was a poor, you were poor, and it was difficult and challenging, and many people went through that period of time. There was a saving grace, however. We had a president called Roosevelt. How did that administration, those programs and policies impact your life and your character, the shaping of your character too?
Yes, one of the reasons why my family left the coal fields of Colorado was because the mines shut down. By this time, the war had ended, and king was no longer, coal was no longer king. So we moved to San Francisco, where unfortunately in the middle of the Great Depression, there wasn't much work available. So my dad had to scrounge around doing odd jobs, but thanks to President Roosevelt and the New Deal, programs like the WPA, Works Public Administration, and other civilian conservation corps were set up to provide jobs for men and women who were out in the cold in terms of no employment. And in addition, through the Department of Agriculture, food, well, not food, but milk and cookies. I remember graham crackers being served during recess for students in need. And so I think that I began to develop an appreciation for the role of government in helping get on their feet during times of need. And I think the idea that President Reagan espoused later, will get government off our backs, or the idea that if every church in America took over or adopted a needy family, that we would have no need for welfare in America as we see it. Well, I think that's a lot of rubbish. I think we need to have government to intervene in those times when we need help. I remember a conversation that I had with Cesar Chavez about the idea that pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps is a very laudable idea. But the fact of the matter that many of us owe our development and our progress to outside help, to the intervention of other groups. Continue with my personal story, at age 9, I lost a leg playing in the train fields. And the loss was, of course, devastating to my parents and to me, but one of my parents' concern was, how are we going to buy a $116 leg that he needs, which they couldn't afford. I think at the time we were paying $16 a month for rent, and my dad was unemployed. But thanks to my elementary school principal, we were referred to what was then called Crippled Children's Society, and they purchased my first leg, which today would cost maybe $30,000. So I was literally helped to get back on my feet. So here again, I developed an appreciation for the private sector, for the charitable sector that helped increase or sustain the dignity and worth of people in need of help, but also individuals. Of individual people who have mentored us along the way, individuals that took the time by way of example and courage to show us how we can move forward with dignity. I remember my first protest over an issue, a civil rights issue, was one that happened in my home in San Francisco when I was about 10 years old. An employee of the local grocery store insulted my brother. He came home crying, very upset. And yes, my mother checked out. My brother had been insulted. And my mother said, well, we're going to boycott that store. So for a year, we walked down the hill near the store, carrying our food up the hill again. And for a year, we did that in protest. And after that, the owner's wife came to this house and apologized profusely over the insensitivity of the employee who was since fired, and they hired my brother part-time. That was my first experience. My second experience when I was 17, I was just a freshman in college, and a much admired professor, John F. Beecher, refused to sign a loyalty oath. There was a time in California the teachers had to sign a loyalty oath proving that they were not communists. Well, John Beecher, related to the Beecher family of Uncle Tom's Cabin and Harriet Stowe Beecher, was part of that history. He refused to sign, and I was devastated. It was just really uncanny to me that somebody had to sign a piece of paper to say they weren't a communist. Years later, I'm talking about 25, 30 years later, the Supreme Court, California State Supreme Court, overturned that law, and John Beecher was reinstated in his position. And by this time, his health had been broken and he did not do too well economically. But I always admired what John Beecher had done. And I thought, wow, I mean, this was so inspiring, because growing up from elementary school through high school and college, I had no Latino professors or teachers. And that was, so where were my role models come from? They had to come from outside that. So then my other role models came from people like Fred Ross, a brilliant organizer with Saul Alinsky's Industrial Areas Foundation, where in a little barrio called Sal Si Puedes, which means get out if you can, young activists like Cesar Chavez and myself learned the art of community organizing. It was there that we changed the whole idea of from Sal Si Puedes, get out if you can, to Si Se Puede, yes we can. And it was there that we had neighborhood improvement. We had street lights and sidewalks, traffic lights put in, and finally the recreation center. But the important thing about the organizing we did in Sal Si Puedes throughout California was, of course, the physical improvements of the neighborhoods, but it was the training and development of leadership. For example, the Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huertas, Cruz Reynoso, who was our first Supreme Court Justice, Gilbert Padilla, and names of folks in Bakersfield, in Tulare County and Monterey County, young men and women whose children are now becoming active in the legislature and in activism. So along the way, it was this training and development that was given or shared with by other people like Ross Alinsky, that moved us. There was a Catholic priest, Father Don McDonnell from Sal Si Puedes, who taught us about the Catholic encyclicals, about the rights of labor to organize, about the rights of immigrants, and about economic justice. We learned from the American Friends Service Committee, the beauty and the effectiveness of nonviolence. During the civil rights struggle, we engaged very closely with groups like the NAACP, the Japanese American Citizens League, the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish Labor Committee. We were councils for civic unity and so on. These were older, more experienced workers than the young guys that were coming up through the ranks. But here again, they shared with us what they knew and what they had learned. I mean, after all, the NAACP had been started by wealthy white people in the early 1900s, whereas groups like the CSO in LA, where they pioneered, were only getting started right after World War II. So we had a lot of catching up to do, but through it all, we were there. We passed fair housing and fair employment legislation. So that's where I think those influences mean a lot. It was these outside influences that helped us to indeed pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, but we didn't do it alone. We had a lot of help along the way.
Well, there has to be help along the way. And I know that when I went to grad school for my credential, I had ran into Professor Julian Nava, who was a Harvard-trained historian at Cal State Northridge. And we're not related, but we did have lunch together, and he encouraged me to apply for a Danforth Foundation fellowship for grad school to go back to UCLA, my alma mater, in US history. And of course, that changed my life because I met, Juan Gomez Quinones, who was a Chicano professor there and an advocate, and, somebody that was influencing Mecha and students moving up and down the state and getting engaged in social justice. And it was a very exciting time. And it seems like we've had these periods about every 20 years. I'm picking up from you, that First World War, and then the Depression. And then in the 50s, we had the McCarthy era. And we had the miners' strike in New Mexico, southern New Mexico. Salt of the Earth is a film that still is being shown and revived because it's important to show the power of people. And in that case, the women were the ones who enabled that strike to be successful because the men were Taft-Hartley out of striking. Yes. So these periods are very, very important in our history. And you're right, they're not in the history books. I just learned the other day that Santa Anna attacked the Alamo because he didn't want Texas, which had been part of Mexico, to become a slave state. Nobody told us that in our history books.
No, that's not, no.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing is that a lot of our own people, a lot of Mexican American Latinos are not aware of the history. They've been robbed about their own history because it's not in the text, it's not in the curriculum. For example, people really don't know that in the 1930s, about 80% of California schools were legally segregated, where Mexican American children were segregated from the rest of the kids. And a lot of people don't know that the reason for that is that the farm bureaus were in control of school boards. And they felt that by educating Latino kids, that they would not have a source of citrus workers to pick the oranges. So they controlled the curriculum, and they really didn't care about the poor quality of education that Mexican American kids were getting. So there's a person by the name of Hector Tarango from Orange County who repeatedly tried to get the school boards to make changes, and they refused. So in 1945, again, thanks to Fred Ross, who was then doing some organizing, helped to get a pro bono attorney in Los Angeles to file a lawsuit in the federal court to restrain the discrimination in the Westminster School District, where Hector was concerned about. He filed, now remember 1945, the schools were segregated. He filed a lawsuit in 1946. Judge Paul McCormick of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that it was unconstitutional and unlawful to segregate Mexican American students on the basis of ancestry, skin color, and Spanish language. And it was Hector who got the Mendez family and 3 other families to join their name to the Mendez versus Westminster School District. Well, what's interesting that in 1947, Thurgood Marshall, who was then legal counsel for the NAACP, who was following the Mendez versus Westminster decision, visited Hector Tarango to learn more about the suit. So he went back to Washington and filed the same kind of suit and took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1954, there was a landmark decision, the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, which found racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. And yet to this day, you will not find a school or bridge or memorial to Hector Tarango. So what I'm saying is that it's bad enough that leaders like this were not recognized, but more than that, our own kids, a lot of people don't feel that, or Anglos don't feel that Latinos suffered any discrimination. So I think that there's a great injustice that's caused because they don't see us. And as someone said, it's like looking in a mirror and not seeing your face there. You know, you begin to wonder, must be something wrong with my eyes or something wrong with the mirror or something else. So that's why I think we can't blame our young people for being ignorant about these things, because where are they going to get this knowledge? And I think your program hopefully will allow people to get an understanding that these problems existed. And there are other problems that exist today that need to have our attention because they're grave problems that affect the future and present future well-being of Hispanics and other people in this country.
Well, we certainly will be looking at all that in a few minutes because I do want to discuss with you, what you've learned from the foundation experience and your corporate experience. But let's fast forward because all of these patterns, they're really patterns, and we seem to swing one direction or another. Policies open up, we start to help people, we do proactive things. We've got a Build Back Better Now initiative going now, and yet there is some opposition, and there's also a tremendous effort to move democracy backwards and to deconstruct many of our programs and policies that have been forward moving and they've been helping to move us forward towards that more perfect union. So if we move forward, because you were a social worker for a number of years, you got your master's in social work. I was an untrained social worker, an unlicensed social worker, and I worked one of my first jobs was to counsel high school dropouts during the war on poverty in the Neighborhood Youth Corps program. Then I worked for United Way. I directed later a program for them. And it was that involvement with those young girls to seeing the problem of them dropping out in the middle of the 10th grade that got me active in creating a leadership and empowerment program for young Chicano women and displaced homemakers. So we started doing the same things that you were instructed to do, by Fred Ross and those kind of empowering activities and teaching us that we can advocate. And we spoke, a group of us spoke before the Commission on the Status of Women. And because of that, I said, wait a minute, why don't we have any representation here? There was all old ladies, all white old ladies. And, I was 20 something. And we ended up getting a Latina Chicana elected, or she was a Republican. It was under the Reagan administration, but we got Richard Alatorre's help, and he was politically wise, and we got a Republican resume amidst all the others. And we got somebody appointed, which made a huge difference to have the first Mexican American on that body. So it's amazing what we can do when we just say, wait a minute, this is wrong. And I want to pick up on that because that started my whole activist career, and it also, because of the desire to serve and to help build bridges and to help build a better community and advocate, for women and Chicanas and Chicanos and families, that gave me my opportunity in television as the first Mexican American woman to be on a network affiliate in Los Angeles. So let's talk about servant leadership as we segue into, your corporate experiences, moving out of social work and reform and activism onto those stellar, kind of very, what's the word? They're very, they can be very intimidating until you get to know them.
Well, I think the question of where will the leadership come from to sustain the work that's needed to solve the problems that we face in the last 50 years and the new problems that we're facing going forward. You have expressed the importance of the not-for-profit sector in the training, development of young and motivating young leadership, which is terribly important for our community that has been left behind in so many ways. And our young people need motivation, but they also need training, they need skills. One of the great sources of money to support these kinds of work, of activities, have been foundations, the philanthropic sector, sometimes referred to as the third sector. This is an area that I'm very concerned about, because we have not made great strides in philanthropy by any measure, whether it be the number of grants that are given by foundations to Latinos, or board representation as trustees or on staff, or on access, or on core support. By any measure, foundations are laggards, not leaders, in support of Latino causes. Why do I feel about this? Because in 1975, I completed a report supported by the National Science Foundation titled U.S. Foundations and Minority Group Interests. What I found, Yolanda, was that at that time we were about 5% of the population, and we were getting about 0.8% of the money, the foundation money. Today, we're what? Anywhere from, I've heard, 16 to 20% of the population. We're getting 1.4% of the money. That's not much of a growth. And if you, what are the reasons? Is there something wrong about the foundations? No, it's not the structure about foundations. It's the people aspect of it. It's about the trustees and staff who make decisions about the flow of money. So why is that a problem? Because 88% of trustees are whites, and the same number of staff people are whites. So it's any wonder that we're not on the radar screen of philanthropy that give away money. And while it is true that as a result of Black Lives Matter, there's been a lot of money that's been going out, unsolicited money really, to social justice organizations to respond to Black Lives Matter. Well, you know, I did some notes on this, and I found that about 21% of Blacks, African Americans, said that they participated in marches and demonstrations. Well, I found that about 20% of Latinos have participated in those kinds of actions. So that we are concerned about the fact that we are facing problems in the criminal justice system. We still don't have the ratio of college graduates that we need to have in order to sustain this leadership. They don't all have to be college graduates, but for the jobs of the future, college education is mandatory and a must. We have a problem that continues with respect to the problems of lacking representation in the C-suites of the corporate rooms or corporate board members on corporations and foundation boards and so on. So what I'm looking at is that what do we have to do to change this phenomenon where we're being excluded? I did a study and found that there were two major commissions, citizen commissions, very prestigious, basically controlled by white, wealthy men, not many women, and no minority, very few minorities on those commissions, that did studies, and they were more concerned about preserving the tax deduction so that wealthy people can continue to get money. And there is legislation, for example, that would, Senator Grassley of Maine, for example, or of Iowa, introduced legislation to increase money flowing from donor-advised funds held by groups like Fidelity and Vanguard and other organizations, where people get an immediate tax deduction for the charitable donations they made. And Senator Grassley feels that by requiring an additional by requiring a 5% payout, like it is for the foundations, that more money will flow for charitable causes. Well, my argument is, well, so what? I don't think that's going to mean we're going to see 5% more increase in grants to Latinos. There's nothing in the history that shows, even with more money around, which is happening, and even with COVID, that more money is being given to charitable causes. I don't see that amount of money going to Latinos. So one thing has got to change. We've got to address the weaknesses of foundations. And yes, it's true. I have served on my side a number of 4 or 5 very prestigious, preeminent foundations. So I know the strength of philanthropy throughout the world. I've visited those programs throughout the world. I'm aware of the Green Revolution supported by the Rockefeller Foundation to end starvation in Latin America, or to fight yellow fever that built the Panama Canal. I visited rice research projects in the Philippines, the tropical research projects in Cali, Colombia, or the programs in Kenya to fight ticks disease and other wonderful programs. So I'm not being an ingrate. Here I am, one of the few Latinos, often the only Latino on these boards. Do I sound like an ingrate? And here I am saying something's got to change. Yes, something's got to change. And I think we need to address reform. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. We have in this country a very large group of white-controlled elitist environmentalists. And for years, they have been receiving millions of dollars from foundations who continue to support what will be regarded are worthy causes. But the problem is that only until recently have they started to acknowledge the fact that they need to put people who are minorities on their boards of trustees. So what is the source of the problem? The source of the problem are the foundations. Either they knowingly or not knowingly contribute to support white-controlled organizations. This sets up a situation, what I call intellectual apartheid, where it appears like where they're saying, well, only white people have the knowledge and the skills to deal with climate change or with all of the mitigation of policies to deal with climate change and so on. So I'm arguing that foundations have got to wake up and realize what they're doing. If we expect to have a country filled with justice and equity, then they have to adopt what I would say policies that they can do voluntarily. They don't need legislation to integrate their boards. They don't need a law that would require them to have more outreach, to be more accessible. 77% of foundations do not allow unsolicited proposals. So how are you going to access a donor advised fund with Vanguard or with Charles Schwab? How are you going to do that if you don't Fidelity? You don't know anybody, you don't have contacts there. How is an organization, a barrio-based organization needing help for its services going to access these resources? So unless you have contacts or some way of getting to these groups, you're out in the cold.
Well, there seems to be a disconnect between the corporate side of the world and the foundation world, because the corporations are the ones that are giving some support and awareness to Latinos, funding different projects. And because they understand that Hispanics in the United States are a $2 trillion market, and we're about to exceed France as an economic force in the world. So, you know, they get that we are we're employees, we're managers, we're CEOs. We spend money. We're a $2 trillion market force in this country. And yet that's not public information. And certainly the foundations aren't aware of that, because otherwise they'd be pouring money into supporting us, because we are the future as generationally young, empowered, active people with an immigrant attitude that want to come and have dreams and really fulfill the American dream. So it is a disconnect that I'm wondering how you're thinking we can bridge that gap.
Well, I think you're right. I think corporations, those that I consider to be socially responsible, understand, they read the tea leaves, they see what kind of size of market as you've just described, and they're more vulnerable to the market and to the attitudes of Latinos. When Latinos refused to buy Coors beer, for example, there was a boycott. They woke up and now do very generous support of Latino causes. So, but foundations don't run for office. They don't depend on popularity contests. They're based in locations where Latinos may or may not exist. So access becomes a point of challenge for us. And so, whereas corporations can be approached in terms of the marketplace, foundations don't care. They don't need to be concerned about what we think. I mean, they could care less. They continue to develop their endowments and spend down their endowment at only 5% payout. So they don't have to worry about the future. They know they're going to be around. But if we begin to stand together and say, it's time to change, we've got to call for reform. And so we need to move in the direction of challenging foundations to be more responsive to Latino causes and to color-led organizations. It's not enough, for example, for a foundation to say, well, we've just given X $1 million for color-led organizations. Well, I agree, that's noble, but my answer would be, how much did you give to specific, to Native American, to women, to LGBTQ organization? Break it down so we know exactly what you're talking about. Otherwise, we're left behind. We need foundations to issue annual reports as required by the government. You can go through what is called a Form 990, go through pages and pages, and it tells you nothing about the guidelines. And then if they don't accept proposals informally, how do you access it? So we need change. And I might add, Joe Cotto, a former assembly member with the state assembly, introduced a bill in 2017, AB 624, in which he would have required transparency and accountability by foundations, requiring them to talk about how inclusive and diverse their boards were and where their money was flowing.
Herman, I love your passion, your commitment, your constant movement and strategic thinking that's been going on over the decades of your life. And I want to ask you now, what do you recommend to people who are interested in moving into some of these upper echelon circles? How can people prepare themselves for those kinds of responsibilities?
One of the questions I do get asked is exactly that. How did I get into the boardroom? What did I do? Well, so the surprising thing is, despite all of the years on the picket line against the Washington Redskins because they refused to hire brownskins, against Auto Row because they refused to hire minorities, against the war in Vietnam and other against the agricultural owners of the grapes, helping Cesar with the grape boycott. Despite all of that, despite all the years of activism, I managed to get on these boards, and it's not something I wish for. You know, my parents never owned stock in any company. You know, we never even talked about the boardroom. And so why did it happen? I think it happened because activists become known in the community. And I think the other part of that is that responsible activists, people who get involved but take responsibility for change in a responsible way. In other words, you organize for responsible social change. Those of us and those who want change have to take responsibility for change. So again, more to my surprise than anything, I received a call to join the board of Pacific Telephone and Telegraph Company. The story behind that was the United Way of America in the Bay Area had never made grants to Latino community-based organizations. So I set up a group called Baruf Bay Area Raza for United Funds, and we picketed United Way. And it so happened that the chair of the United Way at the time was a very nice man by the name of Jerry Hull. And so one day I got a call from Jerry's office asking me to have lunch with him. So I had lunch with him, and he wanted to get a sense of my view of the company. And I said, well, you know, I felt that, you know, there was a lot of things that you probably can do to make the company more appreciated, like having better affirmative action policies and so on. But I said, you're also a leader in the community. You're not just CEO of a company. I said, you're head of United Way, and I think something's got to change there. And he said, you're right. And he said, by the way, your opinions are the reasons why we'd like you to join our board of directors. I almost fell off my chair because I had no idea what it was about. I could have just kind of bombed myself out of the water. But also, I think that relationships do count for a lot. I had met Ruth Chance, who was at that time the executive director of the Rosenberg Foundation, one of the finest, best organizations in the country. And Ruth Chance is a very highly respected CEO of a foundation, and used to call me from time to time to get my opinion about particular things going on in the community and how Rosenberg might help. And so we developed a good relationship. And at one point, I got a call to join the board of trustees of the Rosenberg Foundation. And then that led to Rockefeller, and then that led to the San Francisco Foundation, that led to the California Endowment, and so on. So what I say to young people, don't be afraid of getting involved. Don't be afraid of giving back. You know, as long as you're obeying the law, you're going to be okay. But if you don't act, and I think it's a big question that I look for, is I really pray that the next generation of leadership will be bold and not be timid. When I think of Ed Roybal, when I think of Bert Corona, when I think of a lot of people who, Dr. Ernesto Galarza, for example, long before Cesar Chavez was a household name, was out there challenging the underpinnings of agribusiness, how they exploited workers. And it was Ernesto that stopped the Bracero program, stopped a program that for 13 years had brought 3.5 million workers, temporary workers from Mexico to work in the fields. It was Ernesto who was one of the first to show that it would be futile to organize domestic farm workers unless you stop temporary workers. And he fought and led the fight to stop the Bracero program. Yet people hear about Cesar, but they don't hear about the foundation that Ernesto created in order to move farm worker movement. So a lot of folks don't get the limelight. And I think that that's okay, as long as you realize that what you're doing, as in the song for chorus line, I did what I did for love. Because, you know, you have to have some sense of responsibility, but also know why you're doing it. You know, what are your values? Why do you do this? Well, I, for one, value the building and sustaining of resident power, community-based power, as a solution to many of the problems that we face in our society. An old friend, John Gardner, once wrote that democracy begins with us. We cannot let it end with us. And with all of the dark money floating around, with hundreds of millions of dollars floating from rich people to raise suspicions about immigration, they're anti-immigration, they're anti-climate change. They dispense all kinds of fake news that undermines our democracy. And so we have, I think that organizing today is more difficult than it was years ago. In the old days, we were afraid of being labeled as communists. But to solve that, we would invite Father McDonald or another priest to our meeting wearing the Roman collar to show that we were okay, we weren't communists. But today, you can try to do the right thing and you'll be accused of something else from people you never know about, you've never heard about. I mean, there's a lot of hatred and cynicism going on in this country, and many of our own people bite into that stuff. So organizing is very difficult. And I think young people thinking about moving into the sweet suites have to take responsibility for change. You know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You know, if you want to get ahead in corporate America or in foundations, you've got to play your dues. And there's nothing wrong with having tried to bring about change if you act in a responsible way. And that's all I've ever tried to do. I mean, people have gone to jail for things they believe in, look at Martin Luther King and so on. And there are times when you have to know that maybe you will have to pay the penalty for that. But on the other hand, you know, to raise your voice, to challenge institutional power, even if it's at some cost to yourself, then that's what you have to prepare to do. You can't
you do, and I think it is a time for boldness. It is a time for boldness. And you made the point of, you know, you had been very honest and forthright, and you spoke your word, and then you're offered, you know, a board position. I had a similar time like that when I was in my 20s, and I was working at United Way, and I'd been the director, a very successful director. We had the most successful job placement training program among all of the war on poverty programs, you know, manpower development programs for high school dropouts, disadvantaged youth. And so I gave my farewell talk, you know, at some meeting of the United Way higher ups, and it was a very white organization at that time. They hadn't had any kind of diversity on their boards or their staffing. I was my staff, and I had multicultural staff to represent the populations of Los Angeles County. So I'm giving my bold statement about what they needed to do and why I had an effective team and blah, 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 blah. Frank, the general manager, I think it was Frank McNamara, I could be forgetting, but it was 50 years ago. And he comes up to me after the lunch. He says, "Yolanda, please don't leave us. We need you. We need you." I said, "I'm gone. You know, I'm gone." And I moved on to the chancellor's office for the state university system, which is another story. But it's interesting how boldness, and I don't know why some people are afraid to be bold. I mean, you're speaking very clearly. Some people may take umbrage with what you're talking about, but you're being honest and direct, and you're being truthful, and you're coming from a place of heart, a place of integrity, a place of, I would say, virtue. And that's one of the things I want to ask you about is which, you know, you're in the book of virtues, you're in the prudence chapter actually. And what have been the virtues that have driven you?
What have been the virtue, what?
That have driven you, that have made your character shape?
Well, I come back to, you know, what are the core values that drive you? I mean, core values that we learn from our families, from our faith, from those places that inspire us and move us. For example, I truly value the energy and the talent and fearlessness of youth leadership. Having come up with the likes of Cesar Chavez and others as a young person, I do value the energy of youth leadership. I just think that direction is important. I value the dignity and worth of every individual. I think respect is a very important thing. We learn those from families. I really do value the issue of diversity and inclusiveness at all levels, including the boardrooms of the hollowed halls of power in America. I value the value of integrity and seek to be honest and accountable and transparent. I also value working for responsible social change. I've said that before, in the spirit and practice of nonviolence. I don't believe in violence, and I think we destroy more than we hope to build. And I value the collaboration with other organizations working in common cause to protect human rights, equity, and justice across the board for all people left behind. And I learned that very early in civil rights. So we learn how to collaborate with others who can teach us something. I remember at first being very put off by people that disagreed with me. And then I learned that, you know, maybe they have something to teach me. Maybe there's something I can gain by the differences that we have. And so I learned, rather than being hostile or angry about these differences, learn to sit down and to listen carefully to what people were trying to tell me, to get it through my thick head, that maybe what they had was maybe something I still couldn't agree with, but I respected and began to understand that maybe there was something I could work with. So I think those things are helpful, of course, to have family support system. This kind of work is hard on families. You're gone a lot. Sometimes you're not able to keep doing all the things you want to do, because you do have to think about the fact that there's more to life than just work, more than just the sense of doing, that there's more to life to have joy and fun. Unfortunately, I've kind of learned this too late. About 25 years ago, my wife bought me a guitar. Still in my office, unopened. I've never learned how to play it. So before I take that last walk in the sunset, I'm going to learn to play the guitar.
You and me both, I think. I played the piano. I want to go back to that. There's another time era I want to take us back to, because it was a very important gathering. And it was 1993, after Congressman Roy Baldwin left Congress after 30 years of service. He was wonderful, man. I met him when I was a little girl. And he later, I reminded him of that because my aunt and uncle had supported him when he was running for city council. But he was a beautiful spirit. We're there celebrating him. I was the mistress of ceremonies that night. And it was you, Bert Corona, Cesar Chavez, and Congressman Roy Baldwin that were at my table. And I wanted to talk to each of you so much and just, you know, ask you questions. But of course, there wasn't the opportunity. And Cesar died just a matter of weeks after that. You had wanted to meet with him. In fact, didn't you set a meeting? What did you want to talk to him about?
Well, you know, I've never forgotten that event, the event that you hosted, that you emceed. And a gathering with the likes of Cesar, Bert, and you, and Congress member Roy Baldwin. Especially, well, Roy Baldwin was very special to me. One time, he wrote a letter of recommendation when I wanted to go to graduate school. And I went to see him to thank him. And he said, look, he said, your being here, thanking me is enough. He says, all I ask you is just help someone else. And that's the kind of person he was. But that dinner was important because I was asked to extend a few brief remarks, which I did. And I told the story about my granddaughter, Natalie, who came to see me about a term paper she was writing about the life of Cesar Chavez. And I went and told her about all the stuff we did starting in Sauce Puedes and beyond. And then her face got very serious, and she said, said, Grandpa, I have a question. I said, yes, Natalie, what is it? She said, Grandpa, how come Cesar's famous and you're not? And I said, I said, Natalie, the Lord works in mysterious ways. But I also told her, I said, Natalie, what we do, we don't do to become marquee names. We don't do it, you know, for applause or for awards. We do it because it's the right thing to do. So after the meeting was breaking up, Cesar and I were exchanging goodbyes. And he said, look, when I finish in Arizona, he said, I'd like you to come to Keene and we can talk. And of course, that never took place because he passed away in Arizona. And so I often thought about it, and I'm glad you asked that. What would we have talked about if I had gone to Keene and meet with him? I think we probably would have talked about our past experiences, but our successes and our failures. I mean, it's important to talk about where we failed to do things that we felt were important and why it didn't work out, and then keep going. And I think we would also acknowledge what I had said earlier, that we have to take into account the help we got from people like a Fred Ross and a Linsky and others, Roy Baldwin, who was older, and also many of the great people in Los Angeles that you were peers with. Henrietta Viscusa, for example, went on to become a very well-known public health nurse in this country, caring about vulnerable populations. You had J.J. Rodriguez, who went on to become the head of the California Labor Federation. Gil Anaya, who was with the steelworkers, A.P. Tony Rios. You had so many folks that paved the way in stopping police unwarranted actions, police brutality, paved the way to get Ed Roy will become the first Mexican-American city council member in 80 years through the CSO voter registration program. These were pioneers even before I got involved, and paved the way for others to get courage to do the right thing. So I think young people have to look at where are the role models, where are the people who have been before us, so they don't think that we've accomplished nothing. You know, we've tried to do our best, and as I said, the problems of the past are still here, but we've made some changes. You know, we've lowered the dropout rate. We have looked at the criminal justice system and agreed it has to change. We have registered our people to vote, but yet one of the challenges, for example, is every year, some 900,000 young Latino men and women in this country become eligible to vote. And yet you have 17 states in this country that have passed voter suppression laws, which make it difficult for people of color to have access to the ballot box. So just in that in itself is a great challenge for young people. So if young people want to be into the boardroom someplace, let them show that you were a leader in helping Latinos to register and to vote, to bring about social change. Show that you worked on getting United Way to be more responsive. And by the way, when I did join the board of the phone company, I was elected and re-elected for various telecom boards for 30 years, continuously. So what was interesting that when I went to one of my first board meetings with the phone company, there were a person there who didn't want to shake my hands because he knew I was very closely allied with Ernesto Galarza, and Galarza had sued him and his company because of agribusiness issues. But later, we got to know one another. His wife was very involved in some projects and got to know her. I got to know him on a personal basis. So he probably no longer viewed me as a militant white-eyed Chicano who was trying to mau for change. So I think we have to let good ideas take time to mature. And sometimes we can have false assumptions about other people from both sides. And I think we have to be mature enough to let that happen. And these are things that we benefit from having mentors, but unfortunately along the way, we don't have a lot of mentors. I'm sure when you first started, Yolanda, you didn't have many mentors that could be by your side to help you to, how do you work through a difficult situation? I remember one time when I had just gotten elected to the board of the telephone company, a shareholder came up to me, pointed her finger in my face, and, well, how did you get on this board? First, I started to say about my background and education, I could be helpful to the company and things. I said, oh no, I said, by the way, I received 197 million shareholder votes. That's how I got elected. So I'm just saying is that if I had had somebody, a Latino who had been on a corporate board to mentor me, by the way, you're going to encounter these kinds of situations and you need to be prepared for that. that they think you're an affirmative action baby. You got on there because you had no brains, but you were there to, you know, because they felt sorry for us or something. I remember one time when I was leaving the Rockefeller Foundation board, I was on the nominating committee. I wanted to replace myself with 2 Hispanics, 1 male, 1 female. And they went through the process of searching. I had given names of groups like Maldef and others to contact for names of people that could easily serve on the board. And the chair of the board came up to me and said, you know, Herman, it's too bad you don't have a dozen Cesar Chavez that we could nominate. Could we put someone like that on our board in a minute? I said, wait a minute. I said, just because you don't read about somebody in New York Times, you don't think anybody else has a brain in their head. And as it was, they selected someone from Los Angeles who was an attorney, and he was working for Warner Brothers, I believe. I learned that he was one of the best trustees you could ever have. And we succeeded in getting 2 people for the first time on the board. When I joined that board, there were 4 African Americans on the board. We got the second one. And one of the board members, I wondered whether he was going to fill out his term. And I said, have you really kind of checked that out? And he said, oh yeah, no problem. Well, a year later, that individual resigned to pursue other interests, and that position was laid vacant for many years. So I'm saying we have to take responsibility for things that we want to do. Another time I had recommended a person to be on a national board. And a year later, a friend of mine that I had given the name to approached me. I said, by the way, how's so-and-so doing on your board? He said, well, she never showed up for a single meeting. So that's an exception. You know, when someone in our community does something off the wall, people kind of approach me on that. I said, look, every community has its share of nuts. You know, we are like any other group. You know, we are vulnerable to perfection and imperfection. We have to be more tolerant of each other and not expect that we all walk on water. So we do need to be generous and forgiving in the way in which we do this kind of work. And so I think people who want to get into this work have to be concerned about pulling the other person behind, giving back to the community, and also do what you do because you're doing it for love.
Well, it's very important to do everything for love, and we certainly need more love and compassion in the world. I want to thank you so much, Herman Gallegos, for joining us today. May God grant you good health and ongoing longevity, because you have so much more to share with us. Thank you for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'm Yolanda Nava, and this is Do You See What I See? See you next time.